Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
And by iOmega, makers of personal storage solutions for your computer, so you can create more, share more, save more, and do more of whatever it is you do. iOmega, because it's your stuff.
This program is funded in part by Northwestern Mutual Life, which has been protecting families and businesses for generations. Have you heard from the Quiet Company? Northwestern Mutual Life.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
Every day, more than 100 people die in car accidents. This one is in Memphis, Tennessee.
We got one unit that's gonna take this child out of here.
In one dreadful moment, 3 lives have been shattered. 2 of these victims will not survive the trip to the hospital. In the last 100 years, more Americans have died in car crashes than in all the wars the United States has ever fought. Is there a way to make these devastating accidents survivable? This is Germany's infamous highway system, the Autobahn. For long stretches, there is no speed limit. Some cars cruise at 100 miles an hour and faster. Occasionally, German police cameras monitor the roads. Most of the time, traffic flows in predictable patterns. But recently, the cameras recorded a shocking event. As shown on the small screen in the lower right, a Mercedes in the oncoming lane is about to round the far corner, traveling almost 150 miles an hour. Playing back the tape, the police were able to see exactly what happened. The car was going too fast to make the turn. It grazed the guardrail on the right, and the driver lost control. After sliding 400 feet upside down, the car comes to a stop on the embankment, and the removable top flies off. Clearly, a horrifying accident. But what happens next is almost unbelievable. The driver climbs out, not only alive, but uninjured. A lucky man, certainly, but he also owes a large debt of gratitude to modern engineering.
The driver in this car was very lucky because he survived a very severe accident with a special safety feature, which is in this model. As you can see, it's a rollover bar, and this rollover bar is very stiff and helps to guarantee a certain survival space.
As the car tilts, sensors trigger the rollover bar to pop up, creating a space between the driver's head and the pavement. Wearing a seatbelt is crucial to keep the occupant inside. Before the rollover bar was introduced in 1986, this kind of accident was unsurvivable. In the last 30 years, science and engineering have helped create much safer cars. Today, no new model hits the showroom without being rammed into walls, barriers, and other automobiles to comply with international standards of safety. But it wasn't always this way. automobile safety came slowly and at the expense of millions of lives. This is a 1929 Chevrolet, crash tested using today's standards.
Well, cars of that era were rickety affairs. They were sheet metal nailed and screwed onto wooden frames, and so they were very insubstantial, and when they got into a serious crash, they pretty much disintegrated.
Survival in one of these motorized coffins was due mostly to luck and the fact that cars were slow and scarce. The automobile age began in Germany. Powered by a combustion engine, the first car was built by Carl Benz in 1886. For years, the automobile was considered a toy in Europe, meant only for the very rich. It was an entirely different story in America. Soon after the turn of the century, low-cost automobiles went on the market, and Americans bought them in staggering numbers, even if the roads weren't always ready for them. As the number of cars increased, so did accidents. By the early 1920s, more than 500,000 people had died in collisions. Yet nobody blamed the automobile. Accidents were considered an act of God, or a bad driver.
It was obvious to blame the driver, the human being, rather than the inanimate object, and so the automobile industry accepted that and therefore assumed that they had no responsibility for designing cars to be involved in accidents.
Automakers avoided the topic of car safety. Sales could be hurt if customers began to think of cars as dangerous machines. There was, however, one aspect of car design so lethal, everyone recognized the need to change it: plate glass windows. A minor collision, even a small rock tossed up by a passing vehicle, could shatter a windshield, sending razor-sharp shards of glass inside. In 1910, a laboratory accident would lead to a major advance in glass safety when Édouard Benedictus, a French chemist, knocked a flask on the floor. To his amazement, the bottle broke but didn't shatter, because it was coated with nitrocellulose, which had dried out, leaving an adhesive film on the inside. Benedictus didn't think much about the incident until he read of an auto accident in which a young girl's face was disfigured by flying glass. Moved by the reports, he went back to his lab. The result was a sheet of celluloid adhesive between two pieces of glass. Bonded together, they made one clear pane, the middle layer holding the lethal pieces in place. An improved form was first used in gas masks during World War I, but it took 16 years and an accident to get safety glass used in cars.
When Henry Ford was designing the Model A, one of his engineers was injured by flying glass from an accident, and he and Edsel Ford decided to offer it in all of the new Model A's, all of the Ford models.
Safety glass was considered such an important advance, car companies even advertised it.
Aha! The Duplate safety glass turns back even the pitcher's bullet delivery. True, the glass cracked, but it did not shatter and fly like ordinary glass. Make a note of that, too, in choosing your next car.
Used in front windshields for almost 40 years, safety glass was an improvement, although far from perfect. This, called the glass necklace, was the unforeseen consequence of safety glass, graphically described in this film from the 1960s.
At impacts of from about 15 miles per hour and up, the glass will break out in a circular hole where your head strikes it. The edges of the hole flex. Your head goes on through. The glass bubble retracts with a collaring effect that entraps your head. When the reaction hurls you back, the flexible perimeter of the hole becomes a jagged weapon of lethal intensity.
The glass necklace caused serious lacerations of the neck and head, sometimes even decapitation. A glass more resistant to breakage was needed, but it couldn't be made so hard that an impact would cause serious neck and brain injuries. The answer was to replace the adhesive with a middle layer of plastic that would stretch but not break. But in most cars, glass plastic is only installed in the front windshield, increasing the danger of ejection in side impact accidents. By the mid-1920s, there were 22 million cars on American roads. The initial demand for automobiles had been satisfied, and sales were in a slump. To spur the market, General Motors instituted the annual model change.
The annual model change was invented by General Motors as a way to get people to replace their cars sooner by basically making them obsolete. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful gimmick which did increase sales and brought great profits, and the public loved it, but it had a negative impact on safety. Styling was where the resources were put, it's where the time and the investment was, and safety took a back seat.
Dazzled by the new styles, most of the car-buying public ignored the carnage on the roads. One accident at a time, cars were taking tens of thousands of lives every year and injuring millions. There was one Detroit physician fully aware of the problem. Plastic surgeon Claire Straith spent most of his time repairing the faces of crash victims.
Well, Claire Straith was the first hero of the auto safety movement. He was the first to recognize that it was automobiles that injured people. It wasn't the accident was just the event, but it was the collision between the passengers and the inside of the car that caused the injuries.
Even in minor accidents, serious injuries would result when the human body met up with the car's interior. Protruding knobs could rupture an eye or sever a nose. Rock-hard dashboards fractured skulls and caused debilitating, crushing injuries. Claire Straith's granddaughter, Janet Straith husband.
He would have gotten in this car and first noticed this rearview mirror with its glass across the front, sharp edges up here. He would have then gone to the dash in the front of the car and seen its hard surface. And then he would have attributed the steering wheel to crushing chest injuries and actually, in some cases, impalement on the metal post that supports the driver's wheel.
Dr. Straith came up with a simple idea that could prevent such horrible injuries.
It was just a foam rubber pad. My father has kept this all these years because he remembers driving around with it in his cars. It was placed over on the dash, attached with two little screws. It would protect the occupants against the knobs and gauges and glass. And it was soft, but yet firm enough to provide some protection for the occupants of the car.
Claire Straith designed numerous pads to fit all different makes and models of cars and tried to market his invention, but it was never a commercial success.
He even talked to Walter Chrysler and Preston Tucker and tried to convince them of the design changes that were necessary to protect patients and his patients, but passengers in the automobiles.
The 1937 Dodge was a direct result of Claire Straith's talk with Walter Chrysler. It had a safety-smooth dashboard with knobs that were recessed. The dash was raised to prevent knee injuries, and the front seat back was padded to protect passengers in the rear. The 1937 Dodge was an improvement, but it had little influence on the auto industry as a whole. Safety would not be its focus for many years.
The auto companies didn't have safety departments the way they do today. There was no basic scientific research. The fundamental work in this area was due to the efforts of one man, Hugh DeHaven, who for the first 20 years financed his own research into this new and very important area.
Hugh DeHaven's interest in safety began with a plane crash during World War I. He was engaged in a practice dogfight, and both planes went down. The other pilot walked away, but DeHaven spent months in the hospital, wondering why he alone was so badly injured. That question became DeHaven's life's work, and that of his friend and colleague, Colonel John Stapp.
Hugh DeHaven invented the art and science of crash investigation. And he was a relentless fanatic whose gospel was, these are not acts of God, they're failures of machinery and negligence and failures of people.
CBS Television brings you The Search.
In 1954, more than 35 years after his plane crash, a documentary about DeHaven's work at Cornell University aired on CBS.
This is the American road. This is where 35,000 of you have a rendezvous with death every year.
The scientists at Cornell studied the forces that injure the human body. To obtain measurements, they bounced plastic heads on dashboards.
This drop will be from the seated position.
And dropped tin men onto knobs. They even studied some human oddities, like the story of Louis Zito, who lost his balance while working on top of this smokestack and fell 15 stories down.
Well, I think it was just plain luck.
Luck, certainly, but science had a lot to do with Zito's amazing survival.
Director of Crash Injury.
Hugh DeHaven analyzed the plunge.
In this case, Mr. Zito, who had fallen from the stack here, fell a distance of almost 150 feet and achieved a speed of approximately 60 miles an hour, 62 miles an hour when he hit the ground.
At that speed, Zito should have died on impact.
Zito came out of this.
What interested DeHaven was why he didn't.
Well, he hit in structure, which was not solid concrete, luckily, and the rubble where he hit acted as an energy-absorbing agent. And as the force was well distributed on his body, there was no localized force which caused any injury.
Zito's survival proved that even severe impact forces can be reduced with padding. But what kind and how much? To test different materials, DeHaven's team used the most fragile object they could think of and dropped it 15 feet down. The materials developed at Cornell would eventually find their way into automobiles. But DeHaven knew that padding wouldn't solve all the problems, and he proved it with some of the earliest crash tests on record.
At the snubbing platform, and you're going to be able to see for the first time what happens to people in a car like this when this powerful force meets an immovable object.
With crash tests, they would prove the central foundation of DeHaven's work, that for every accident, there are really two collisions. The first one occurs when the car crashes into an object.
Now, the same crash in slow motion. Watch the little fellow in the rear.
The second one, when unrestrained occupants inside the car collide with the dashboard, windshield, or even the back seat.
He folded up like an accordion almost, didn't he?